They were supposed to die in prison? But they didn't. Some were sentenced to over 100 years, others were told they'd never see daylight again. Yet, against all odds, these 10 people outlived the system. From forgotten cells to stunning appeals, these are the stories of inmates who beat time itself. Before we start, subscribe to our channel for mind-blowing stories, shocking cases, and criminal mysteries you won't find anywhere else. Now the stories. Number 10. Paul Geidel, the man the world forgot. 68 years behind bars. It was July 26, 1911, in New York City. Inside the luxurious Hotel Iroquois, a 73-year-old man named William H. Jackson, a wealthy broker from Texas, was staying in a private suite. That morning, hotel staff discovered his room had been ransacked, and Jackson was dead, murdered by suffocation. The hotel erupted in panic. A manhunt followed quickly. And within a day, the police had a suspect, Paul Geidel, Jr. He was just 17 years old. Paul wasn't a career criminal. In fact, he had no criminal record. He was the son of German immigrants. His father, a saloon keeper, had died when Paul was just 5. By the time he was 14, Paul had dropped out of school to support his family. He worked in hotels, ran errands, cleaned rooms, and that's how he came across Jackson. Paul later confessed to breaking into Jackson's room to rob him, and then smothering him with a chloroform-soaked rag to keep him quiet. A juvenile act of robbery had become murder. The trial didn't take long. In 1911, with headlines screaming, "Boy Killer Caught," Paul was sentenced to 20 years to life at Sing Sing prison. Sing Sing was no ordinary prison. In the early 1900s, it was one of the harshest and most infamous penitentiaries in the United States. Stone walls, cold cells, hard labor, executions. This was not a place built for rehabilitation. Paul was now inmate number 53,847, just a boy in a cage full of killers. But he didn't break. He didn't rebel. He worked. He kept to himself. Over the years, wardens described him as quiet, polite, and intelligent. And in 1926, 15 years into his sentence, something changed. Paul was transferred to Dannemora State Hospital for the criminally insane. Dannemora wasn't just a prison. It was a hospital for inmates deemed mentally unfit. According to official records, Paul had begun exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. Delusions, isolation, cognitive detachment. Psychiatrists labeled him schizophrenic, though the standards of the time were crude and often unreliable. Paul was now a forgotten man in a forgotten place. Years blurred into decades. He watched guards come and go. He watched inmates die. He missed the Roaring '20s, the Great Depression, World War I and World War II. Entire generations passed while Paul sat in a locked room. By the time the 1950s arrived, Paul had been in prison for over 40 years. Many inmates sentenced after him were already released or dead, but Paul? He remained institutionalized. Some parole boards considered his release as early as 1974, but each time he was deemed unfit for society. Why? Because he no longer understood the outside world. He had entered prison before the Titanic sank. By now, there were computers, nuclear bombs, color television. Paul had no surviving family, no address to go to, no plan for life on the outside, and so the state made a quiet decision. Let him stay. In 1980, a quiet milestone was crossed. Paul Geidel became the longest-serving prisoner in U.S. history. 68 years and 296 days behind bars. He had been locked up longer than Nelson Mandela, longer than any Alcatraz inmate, longer than some countries have existed. In a rare interview from the late 1970s, a reporter asked Paul what he remembered about freedom. He simply said, "I remember trees," and how silence felt before everything was behind steel. He was now 86 years old. Frail, almost blind, but lucid, polite, and strangely at peace. On August 6, 1980, after serving nearly 7 decades, Paul Geidel was finally released. Not because of a court ruling, not because of a pardon, but because the parole board realized one simple truth. There was no point in keeping him anymore. Paul had no home, no family, and had become a relic of a bygone era. So they placed him in the St. Cabrini nursing home in Mount Vernon, New York. For the first time in nearly 70 years, Paul slept in a bed without bars. He walked down streets without guards. He saw the sun rise on his own terms. Paul adjusted slowly. He learned what television was, tried fast food, used a telephone. Nurses described him as gentle, shy, and deeply grateful for even the smallest things. A warm blanket, a quiet room, a visitor. He rarely spoke about the crime. He never expressed bitterness, never blamed the system. "What's past is past," he said in one interview. He lived quietly, reading, watching TV, and enjoying his first ever Christmas outside prison since 1910. On May 1, 1987, Paul Geidel died at the age of 93. His death barely made the news, and his story remains one of the longest, quietest tragedies in the history of American incarceration. One boy, one crime, a lifetime lost, and a lesson for us all, that justice without mercy becomes a sentence no one can serve in full. Number 9. Joseph Lian, sentenced to die in prison at 15. Released at 83. In 1953, a 15-year-old boy was sentenced to life without parole. He wasn't the shooter. He didn't kill anyone. But he was part of a gang, and that was enough. Decade after decade, he stayed locked away, forgotten by time, refusing to take a deal that admitted guilt. He entered prison in a world that didn't have color TVs, and left 68 years later in a world with smartphones, Teslas, and social media. This is the stunning story of Joseph Lian, the boy who survived the system and outlived a life sentence. Joseph Lian was born in 1937 in the Jim Crow South, Alabama. His family later moved to Philadelphia, part of the Great Migration, seeking jobs, safety, and something better. But Philadelphia in the 1950s wasn't easy for poor black families. Crime, segregation, prejudice. Joseph was barely in school. He had learning disabilities. Couldn't read or write well. He struggled, not just in the classroom, but in life. At age 15, Joseph fell in with a group of boys. Not hardened criminals, just kids, directionless, looking for something to belong to. On February 20th, 1953, Joseph and a group of teens went out drinking. That night, they went on what would later be described as a gang rampage. 2 people were killed. Several others were stabbed. Group quickly, there were confessions under pressure. Lawyers assigned were overburdened, and the court moved fast. Joseph, age 15, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He would be the longest-serving juvenile lifer in American history. At 15 years old, Joseph was sent to the adult prison system. He entered Graterford Prison in Pennsylvania, where most inmates were much older, many violent, most serving life. He was a child in a world of wolves. But Joseph adapted. He taught himself to read, lifted weights, studied law. He learned to survive quietly, respectfully. Prison staff said he was a model inmate, but parole? That wasn't an option. He had been sentenced to life without parole. And in Pennsylvania, life meant life. Joseph remained behind bars. By the early 2000s, activists began questioning a dark legacy in American law: juvenile life without parole. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, a violation of the 8th Amendment. Then, in 2016, Montgomery v. Louisiana made it retroactive. Every juvenile lifer had to be resentenced. Joseph's time had finally come. Joseph could have been released sooner. He was offered parole multiple times. But he refused every time. Why? Because parole meant admitting guilt. Saying, "I'm sorry," for a murder he insists he didn't commit. And Joseph? He would not confess to a lie just to win his freedom. In one interview he said, "I've been in prison all my life. That's true. But I still have my integrity." He would rather die in prison than lie to escape it. His lawyers fought harder. On February 11, 2021, Joseph Lian walked free. After 68 years behind bars, he was 83 years old. The oldest and longest-serving juvenile lifer in U.S. history. The world he entered had changed beyond recognition. When Joseph was locked up, Eisenhower was president. Now it was Biden. He had never used a smartphone, never been online, never touched a credit card. His first meal as a free man? Cheeseburger and fries. Joseph was placed in a halfway house in Philadelphia. He was helped by ex-inmate programs, learned how to use a cell phone, got his ID, learned how to ride public transport. He reconnected with extended family, nieces and nephews who barely knew his name. Volunteers helped him adjust, but he had a long way to go. A full life lived behind concrete. Now every step was new. "It's beautiful out here," he said to reporters. "I'm not bitter. I'm just grateful I got the chance." Since his release, Joseph has become a symbol, not of crime, but of forgiveness. Of patience, of how broken systems can be repaired. He speaks at events, talks to youth, warns them about gangs, about choices. He says, you can mess up your life in one night, but it can take a whole lifetime to fix it. His story is now taught in law schools, quoted in reform hearings, and studied by judges across the U.S. A reminder that justice isn't always just, especially for children. Joseph Lian survived more than just prison. He survived a system that once threw kids away. He endured years without hope. And when the laws finally changed, he stood tall. He didn't cheat, didn't lie, didn't fold. In the end, he walked out of prison on his own terms. Not because he begged, but because the world finally realized it was wrong. Joseph Lian's life wasn't stolen in one moment. It was taken slowly, year by year, by a justice system that didn't ask why a child was broken, only how long he should be punished. But the man who came out of that system didn't carry hate. He carried grace. His story is a lesson about punishment, about forgiveness, and about time, the kind of time no one should ever have to serve. Not at 15, not when there's still a life worth living. Number 8. Otis Johnson, 44 years, released at 69. What would happen if you blinked and 44 years passed? If one moment you were walking down a street with a transistor radio and Afro pick, and the next moment, you were standing on that same street, but surrounded by smartphones, electric cars, and people with wires hanging from their ears? This is the true story of Otis Johnson, a man who entered prison in 1971 at the age of 25, and emerged into the world again in 2014 at age 69. This isn't just a story of incarceration. It's about time, how much the world can change, and whether the human spirit can adapt after being frozen for half a century. Otis Johnson was born in the mid-1940s in the Bronx, New York. Raised in a world of civil unrest, racial inequality, and community policing, Otis came of age in a time when young black men were constantly profiled, harassed, and offered few chances. In his own words, "I lived in the streets. I was angry. I was radical. I was lost." In the late 60s, he got caught up in petty crime, drugs, and eventually violence. He became affiliated with the Black Panthers, but his path was less about ideology and more about survival. By the age of 25, Otis was convicted of attempted murder of a police officer during a robbery gone wrong. The sentence? 50 years to life. For Otis, the world stopped in 1971. Otis was moved from Rikers Island to Attica Correctional Facility, one of the toughest prisons in America. He spent decades behind bars. No internet, no cable TV, no education programs. Most of his time was in isolation. He missed weddings, deaths, elections, inventions, and revolutions. The Vietnam War ended. The Cold War ended. The World Trade Center fell and rose again. But in Otis's world, nothing moved except the hands of the prison clock. Somewhere between the anger and isolation, Otis changed. He began meditating, studied Buddhism and Islam. He read whatever he could, trained his mind. And most importantly, he started watching. Watching how other inmates behaved, how prison worked. He said, "I treated prison like a mountain monastery." It became a training ground for discipline. He kept track of time in notebooks, and promised himself that if he ever got out, he'd walk quietly, with purpose. But years turned into decades, and release always felt 1 year too far. Otis applied for parole multiple times. But like so many black inmates sentenced in the 1970s, he was repeatedly denied. Lack of remorse, they said. Institutional risk, they added. The irony? Otis had become a peacemaker inside the walls. A mentor to younger inmates, but still he remained caged. Until finally, in 2014, after 44 years behind bars, someone in the system said, "This man is no longer a threat to society." And just like that, Otis Johnson was free, at 69 years old. Otis stepped outside and saw a world that made no sense. Everyone was looking down at glowing rectangles. Wires dangled from their ears. People talked to themselves in public. He thought they were CIA agents. Later, he found out they were using Bluetooth. Stores were filled with barcodes and self-checkouts. He didn't understand how to cross busy streets. The speed of life was terrifying, Otis said. It felt like walking onto a spaceship, and yet, he smiled. Because freedom, even if confusing, tasted good. Otis had no family, no money, no phone, no ID. He was placed in a transitional housing facility. Lived in a tiny room with a single bulb, a steel sink, and creaky bed springs. But to him, it was a palace. He bought peanut butter and jelly, took walks in the park, watched people, and slowly, day by day, began learning how to live again. In 2015, a news outlet released a video about Otis called, "Man Leaves Prison After 44 Years. This is what he sees." The internet fell in love. Millions of views, thousands of comments. People were amazed, saddened, and inspired by this man's grace. He didn't complain, he didn't blame, he just observed. People asked, how can he be so calm? His answer? Because anger was never going to give me back time. I lost 44 years, but I'm still breathing. That means I still got something to do. Otis didn't try to rush his life. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace. He said, I live like a monk. I don't want TV. I don't want noise. I want stillness, because that's what kept me alive inside. He spent his days walking, meditating, listening to jazz, helping others in the halfway house. When asked what he missed most, he said, time with my younger self. And what scared him most? That I might forget how to feel joy. Otis Johnson is more than an ex-inmate. He's a symbol of how far the world can drift from a single man, of how prison doesn't just take years. It steals futures. But Otis proved something rare. That if you protect your soul, even the darkest cell can't steal your peace. His story is told in schools, shared in social work training. Quoted in courtrooms, Otis Johnson didn't escape prison. He endured it. The world forgot him. But he remembered himself. And when time finally returned to him, he didn't waste it with rage. He walked, slowly, quietly, into a world that had changed, but one where he could still find purpose. Because some people don't just survive a sentence. They outlive it. Number 7. Willie Simmons, life without parole for $9 robbery. What would you say if I told you a man was sentenced to life without parole for stealing $9? No, this isn't fiction. It happened. In America. And the man's name is Willie Simmons. He was 25 years old when he made a mistake. Now he's in his mid-60s, still behind bars decades later. This is not just a story about theft, it's about how the law can become a life sentence, even when justice says otherwise. Willie Simmons was born in Alabama in the 1950s. Raised in a poor, segregated community, he grew up under the shadow of racism and systemic inequality. His father wasn't around. His mother worked 2 jobs. As a teen, Willie struggled with drug addiction, dropped out of school, and started hanging around with the wrong crowd. By the time he was 20, he already had a few non-violent convictions, mostly related to drug use and petty theft. But then, one day in 1982, everything changed. According to court records, Willie approached a man walking along the road. He allegedly pushed him to the ground and stole his wallet, which had $9 inside. That's it. No weapons. No injuries. No gun. Willie was arrested shortly after. It was a low-level robbery, typically 2 to 5 years. But Willie Simmons had 3 prior convictions. So the judge invoked Alabama's Habitual Felony Offender Act, known nationally as a 3 strikes law. The sentence? Life, without parole. Under Alabama's law, any 4th felony, regardless of severity, triggered mandatory life imprisonment. This law was intended for hardened violent criminals. But Willie Simmons, who struggled with addiction and have never harmed anyone, was swept up in its net. His public defender offered little fight. No appeal was filed. Just like that, a man was locked away forever, for $9. Willie was sent to Hallman Correctional Facility, a notoriously harsh Alabama prison. There, he faded into the system. For over 40 years, he hasn't had a single visitor. Not because no one cares, but because his entire family died while he was behind bars. His mother, his siblings, his friends, gone. His only form of expression? Writing. Journaling. He still works out daily, reads religious books, eats in silence. No violence, no problems, just waiting. For decades, no one outside knew his story. Then in 2019, a journalist named Beth Shelburne found his prison record while researching unjust sentencing laws. She reached out to him. He wrote back. And what she uncovered shocked even legal experts. A man who had done everything right inside prison with no chance of release. Her article went viral. Life without parole for $9. People were outraged. Activists, law professors, politicians, but nothing changed. Soon, a petition was launched. Over 400,000 people signed it. Civil rights groups demanded a resentencing hearing. But Alabama law didn't care. Even with overwhelming public support, Simmons' fate remained the same. No parole, no clemency, no exit. One activist put it this way: if stealing $9 at 25 means you lose your entire life, then we are not a society of justice. We are a society of vengeance. When asked if he was angry, Willie said, "I was angry for a long time, but that won't help me now. I found peace. I made peace with God. Now I just wait." He doesn't lash out, doesn't curse the judge. He forgave the system that forgot him, but deep inside there's still hope. Hope that someone someday will say, enough is enough, and he'll get to walk outside before it's too late. Willie Simmons may not be famous, but he represents thousands like him. People who weren't sentenced based on who they were, but on what the law allowed judges to do. He didn't kill, didn't destroy. He stole $9 and paid with his life. So when we talk about justice, we must ask, is it justice if it forgets mercy? Number 6, Albert Woodfox, 43 years in solitary confinement. Imagine being locked in a cell the size of a parking space. Not for a day, not for a year, but for 43 years, alone, in silence, with no human touch. This is the story of Albert Woodfox, the man who spent longer in solitary confinement than anyone in U.S. history. His crime? Not just murder, but his beliefs, his voice, and his refusal to break. This is how a man was buried alive and still came out unbroken. Albert Woodfox was born in 1947 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Like many black men raised in the Jim Crow South, his life was steeped in poverty, racial profiling, and inequality. By his teens, he was in trouble caught in petty crimes, drugs, and survival. In the late 1960s, he was arrested for armed robbery. In 1971, he was sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary. Better known as Angola, the bloodiest prison in America. A former plantation, Angola was still run like one. Brutal, racist, and lawless. But Albert Woodfox entered that prison with a fire inside him. Because behind bars, he had joined the Black Panther Party. Woodfox, along with 2 other inmates, Herman Wallace and Robert King, became known as the Angola Three. They were political, organized. They exposed rapes, beatings, and corruption inside Angola. They started hunger strikes, filed lawsuits, taught other inmates how to read, resist, and reclaim their dignity. To prison officials, they were dangerous. And then, a guard named Brent Miller was murdered, stabbed 32 times. Albert Woodfox was charged. There was no physical evidence linking Woodfox to the crime. No fingerprints. No DNA. The conviction rested on the testimony of a single informant, a prisoner with incentives. Woodfox always maintained his innocence. He said the charge was retaliation for his activism. But it didn't matter. In 1972, he was found guilty. And Angola had a solution for men like him: solitary confinement, 6 feet wide, 9 feet long, no phone, no contact, no programs. For 23 hours a day, Woodfox sat in that concrete box. He had 1 hour to walk in a cage alone. This lasted for 43 years. Some men go insane in a week, others in a year. Albert Woodfox survived 4 decades. How? He said. They may have locked my body, but they never locked my mind. Woodfox meditated, worked out daily, read everything he could get his hands on. He remained committed to the Black Panthers' principles: education, resistance, self-discipline, and most of all, hope. He wrote letters, fought in courts. Every appeal failed. Every attempt at release was blocked. But he kept fighting. Over the years, journalists, lawyers, and activists began digging. They uncovered a trail of injustice. Witnesses coerced. Exculpatory evidence withheld, racist jury selection. Still, Louisiana courts refused to release him. It took 4 decades and 3 overturned convictions before the truth finally broke through. In 2015, a federal judge ruled his conviction unconstitutional. The state tried to retry him again, but then something unexpected happened. On February 19, 2016, Albert Woodfox walked free. It was his 69th birthday. The world he entered was nothing like the one he left. When he went in, there were no smartphones, no internet, no black president. Now, he was a free man. And what did he do? He forgave. He didn't seek revenge, he sought justice for others. In 2019, Woodfox published a memoir, Solitary, a searing account of what it means to be buried alive and still breathe. The book was praised by Oprah, President Obama, and readers worldwide. He toured the country, spoke to students, fought to end solitary confinement in the US. He became a symbol of strength. And yet, behind his soft smile, was a man who had lost everything: his youth, his family, his time. On August 4, 2022, Albert Woodfox passed away from complications of COVID-19. He was 75 years old. He spent 43 years in solitary confinement and just 6 years in freedom. Those 6 years, he lit a fire against prison abuse, against injustice. And for every man and woman locked away in silence, he became their voice. Albert Woodfox proved something many never believed, that even in a box, even under torture, even when forgotten by the world, a man can rise. He lost his life to injustice, but what he gave back was hope. They locked him away, but they could never lock away his spirit. He outlived the sentence and left a world better than he found it.